Welcome to the American Academy of Grief Counseling's Videogram on the grief process and funerals. Funerals are a universal experience within all cultures. Different cultures may express themselves differently on how they process the grieving process or how their religion interprets death. But death itself is a universal human experience, and grieving the loss of a loved one is a universal human experience. Because as sentient beings, we have that feeling, that intuitive ability to question existence itself, what is after, a spirituality and so forth, a metaphysical realm. And because of that, funerals from a religious perspective have always played an important role in society, death rituals and so forth, whether from the Western traditions or the Eastern traditions. The importance of helping the beloved, the one who has passed away, helping them through prayers and spiritual practices to enter into the next realm. So it's a very key element, and funerals as a religious phenomenon play a huge role in the grieving process, and not only helping the individual who has passed away, but also helping the family and the friends who have lost the beloved, and they are now grieving collectively, grieving socially, and so forth. So death rituals, they meet the spiritual needs of the deceased, but they also serve as a memorial to the deceased, supplying psychological, emotional, and social support for the bereaved family and friends, and so forth. Eastern rituals differ, though, slightly than Western rituals. Yes, there's an acknowledgement of death. Yes, there is a process of grieving for those who have lost a loved one. And yes, there's a spiritual aspect to it in both. But Eastern rituals look first and foremost spiritually to free the soul for later incarnations. So not only are the family and friends grieving, but they're also doing a series of rituals that lead to the funeral itself and the cremation aspect of it, where the body is destroyed so that the soul is able to move on. So the process of grief is tied intimately to the spiritual care of the deceased soul and enabling that soul to transmigrate to another realm or to become reincarnated. So the grieving and all of that spirituality is tied together, while the family is first concerned about the welfare of the soul of the deceased, but also helping each other overcome the loss itself. Western rituals do not hold to the idea of reincarnation. You're here, and then after death, you go to the next realm. So there are a series of spiritual rituals that take place for Catholics, last rites and a funeral mass, which then leads to the actual transportation to the cemetery where the body is buried, or if it was cremated, which is now permissible in the West, as long as the spiritual ideology is not accompanied with it. Protestant services are a little bit different. There is no funeral mass and there are no last rites, but there are a series of prayers. And in the West, very much similar to what Catholics would experience, going to a funeral home if they so desire, and visiting the body, giving your last farewells, and having maybe a sermon, and then going to the cemetery itself. In Jewish traditions, simplicity, if you're traditionally Jewish and you're not as much westernized, there's a lot of simplicity to it. The individual is put in a white gown in a wooden casket, and then is laid to rest, starting at the synagogue and then going to the grave itself. In Islam, very similar again, a white shroud is put on, there is no cremation, and the person is then laid to rest. But beforehand, there is a a process of cleaning the body very meticulously for impurity, which correlates with spirituality itself. So with Western tradition, sometimes some of these religions from the East or the Middle East might have to adhere to various state regulations and so forth. But overall, there is a very common ideal in the Western rituals that the body doesn't reincarnate. I mean, the soul does not reincarnate in another body, but there is much care given to the body. There is a time for individuals to come together and say their collective prayers, whether it's within the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, or the Judaic tradition. The prayers differ, but for the most part, the prayers are said. Then there is the cemetery. And then in some traditions, there's a wake. Other traditions, they have other ways of showing grief for maybe a longer period of time, for even up to a year in some religious traditions. But ultimately, whether you're from the East, the West, Christian or Jewish or Islamic, grieving is something that is needed to be seen and displayed at a funeral. The funeral itself meets the spiritual needs of the loved one, but also the emotional and psychological needs of the bereaved, and how they display that grief for the first time socially, for the first time in front of others. And this has a lot of importance in accepting that the fact that this person is gone now and that there is no turning back. The denial phase is eliminated at the funeral for most in healthy grieving. Seeing the body, going through the service allows that individual to finally come to some sort of acceptance that the loved one is now gone. But during the whole event of the funeral, the process of the funeral, the individual is able to process the grief with the help of others. The social support that comes from a funeral is extremely, extremely important. And you can also talk to other family and friends and share and commemorate, in some cases, not just grieve, but to commemorate the life of the deceased. So it has a lot of meaning, more so if you think about it, for the living. If the spiritual needs have already been met privately, then the rest of it is to help those who are still here be able to comprehend the loss, deal with the loss, and move forward to some extent in the grieving process. After the funeral, though, is when the real grief begins for the immediate family themselves. This is where the grief process becomes so real that the loved one is no longer part of their life. Many after the funeral, who are maybe distant family or distant friends, they move on, and they sometimes forget that I went to a funeral earlier this year. For them, life resumed. For those who lost the aunt, the uncle, the cousin, the mother, the father, they have to continue to they have to continue to crawl through life in some cases, even when it's difficult, and they have to learn to cope and be able to deal with these emotions and these feelings. And it's very difficult, especially as the months go by, with anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, special events, and realizing that that one chair is still empty. And it even becomes even more difficult a year later when they realize that the death anniversary is just as big of a day on their calendar as the individual's birthday used to be. Beyond the funeral, what can friends and family do? Stay in contact with the bereaved. Checkups are really nice. Just a call on a special day, ask how they're feeling, acknowledge their pain, and so forth. Within Catholic tradition, mass cards are usually sent afterwards, just to remind individuals that you're still thinking about them. Some individuals need counseling, and that counseling helps them be able to commemorate eventually the life of the deceased through various things. So those death anniversaries or those holidays become less painful as time progresses, and you're able to maybe smile about some things. But leaving the bereaved after the funeral without any words or any checkups or any "how are you doing," that is something that many individuals do, and it's not done intentionally. It's not a callous response. It's just we forget, especially if it's not someone that was close to us, we forget. And it's important to be empathetic and to remember that after the funeral, grief continues within the immediate family. If you would like to learn more about the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals Grief Counseling Certification, please feel free. There is a link below that can take you to our page, and there you'll learn about the courses that are required to take it. We also have a funeral associate certification while you're there if you want to check that out. The program is online. It's independent study. You can utilize your instructor as much or as little as you want as you work through the program. After completion of the courses, you can then apply for a 4-year certification and renew that as you see fit. So it really is a great program. It's been around for 20 years now, actually, and it can really help individuals who are in pastoral ministry, working with funerals and so forth, help the bereaved during the funeral and also after the actual funeral itself. If you'd like to contact our office, our number here is 330-652-7776. Again, that number is 330-652-7776. And our email is info@aihcp.org. Again, that's info@aihcp.org. So when we look at grief and the purpose of the funeral, we realize that it is not only a spiritual event for the deceased, but it's also very much a cultural and social event to help the bereaved move forward. And for many, it's the first time that they come to grips and reality that someone has died, and there's no room for denial anymore. It's a great time for us to come and help those who have lost an immediate family member and to acknowledge that loss with them. But let's remember that after the funeral, grief continues, and just to simply forget is sometimes as bad as not even attending the funeral itself. So we want to be able to give continued support, even if it's a small little hello or a card in the mail and so forth. Those things really, really mean a lot to someone who loses someone 4 months later after the funeral, or 6 months, or a year later, and so forth. Letting them know that you're still there for them and that you think about it. So with that, I'd like to wish you a good day and take care.